Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 7th of November. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Brisbane G20 shaping up to be a geopolitical battleground. And unemployment is a crisis. We need economic development. So first, Brisbane G20 shaping up to be a geopolitical battleground. Craig, the G20 is roughly a week from now, right? And
right.
Poor old Brisbane, I wouldn't want to live there for the next week or so. This is the 20 most important or the biggest economies of the world. Their leaders are coming. So you can imagine anywhere that Obama's at and President of China and President of Russia, the security is just going to be hell.
So 100 or 200 people travelling with them each time. So there's a huge number of security issues.
Anyway, that's going to be rough for them. But we've been talking about this summit all year from the standpoint of bail-in, because the bail-in agenda that we've been exposing was always geared around being finalised at this event. Now, what's happening though is the strategic tensions that are rising between the transatlantic powers, the US, the UK, Europe, which for 200 years plus have been the dominant part of the world, right? They dominate the world economy. They are now being eclipsed by the rising powers of Asia and Eurasia, right? And there's tensions over that. And that tension is starting to overtake the agenda at APEC. So who knows what
and the
bail-in
G20,
and the G20, that's what I meant. Who knows what bail-in what the discussion about bail-in will take. I was going to talk about this later, but we may as well talk about it now. We do know that the Brits, who the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is the head of the Financial Stability Board. And they are still intending to go there and say, look, we all need to agree to this bail-in plan. And the specific plan they're talking about has taken a slightly different form than we've talked about for a while. And that is, ever since we made a stink about it, and the reaction to what happened in Cyprus, no one who talks about bail-in now talks about deposits. Now, just because they don't talk about it doesn't mean deposits aren't in the firing line. But they've come up with this idea of bail-inable bonds, and there's a sneaky element to these bail-inable bonds because they say we're going to issue, all banks will have to issue bonds that everyone who buys them knows that if there's a crisis, the value of these bonds will disappear first. And so you wonder who's going to buy those things.
Well, that's the point, Robbie. You've got nearly a $2 trillion superannuation pool.
Exactly.
And what the banks and what these parasites are trying to do is create instruments where this huge pool of money can invest in those instruments. Now, the problem with it is that most people don't have the ability or understanding. They have the ability, but they don't really understand how their superannuation works, which is where this $2 trillion is tied up.
Well, if their money's in super, they're not making, they don't have any control over it. Someone else is making decisions for them.
So the superannuation funds are the ones that have been targeted here to get your money, my money invested in these bail-inable bonds. Now, they might go okay for a little while, but as soon as there is a major eruption, such that those banks, there's a downturn in the real estate market or whatever, it's those bail-inable bonds and the shareholders' funds that become liquid first. In other words, ta-da money. And now, most people don't know this is what's on the cards, but this is what we mean by bail-inable, because currently, bonds aren't bail-inable.
And in practice, just like in Cyprus and what we've been warning about with deposits, it will be the ordinary people who pay with their real savings to keep bad banks propped up.
And this is the tyranny of this whole discussion.
Yeah. So the British Mark Carney intends to go there with that agenda. But what else is going on? Well, let's just go through the two different broad agendas that are going to be on display at the G20, Craig. Coinciding with the G20, the President of China, Xi Jinping, and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, the two biggest populated countries in the world, and now China is effectively the biggest economy in the world, and they are the mainstays of the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, these are the two biggest countries of that power bloc that is working together. They're staying for state visits. And what they want to do is they both independently have a relationship to Australia. They want to have a relationship to Australia. and they want to consolidate that relationship. Now, so they're staying there for our benefit. China is rapidly, so rapidly in fact, forging ahead with, because it's committed to economic development, it is striking deal after deal after deal with countries that are based on economic development. These are not free trade deals where Andrew Robb sits down over a table from him and says, what industries will we give up and what industries will you give up? What industries will we sacrifice? What industries will you sacrifice? No, they're not those types of deals. These are economic development deals where both sides benefit, right? And they are striking deal after deal, not just with, say, the 20 nations who joined the Asian Infrastructure Bank instead of us 2 weeks ago, but even with countries like, just this last week, Mexico, Chile and Bolivia. These are Latin American countries in America's own backyard. And what's happening, these deals that China is doing, that's trumping America's plan for a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade group deal China's excluded from. And America is doing this to try and keep its dominance in the region. Well, and China's trumping this.
Well, Robin, this is really interesting in the events that have just transpired this week with the backlash against Obama in the United States. This is what you've seen with the vote there, the very, very, very poor voter turnout, and the Republicans getting it is a voter impeachment of Obama. This guy is finished electorally across the board, and that means America in the way it's going is finished the way it is, because it is still pushing policies of the British that have been completely rejected by the people. You've had a second George Bush in there for the last 4 years.
Yeah. So America's agenda has just been rejected by American people, and they want to ram it down the throats of Asia.
Yeah, and that's what's being seen here. And I think the state visits are paradigmatic of that, because I think Obama is so on the nose now, actually, politically, that he hasn't been invited to address the Australian Parliament, where these other two leaders have.
Yes. Well, let me just say something about that. So India, which is also a very rapidly growing economy, and under Modi it's going in leaps and bounds. They're also doing deals, Craig, and their deals though they're quite strategic. And see, India has never been treated like China. India is a democracy, remember, the world's biggest democracy. So we sort of look at them in a kindly way, whereas there's all this suspicion about China. But they've just done deals with Russia, military deals that they've just signed ahead of Putin's visit there. So anyway, America and the Brits and Europeans are looking at this, and they're freaking out, and they are organising their own, they're trying to counter-organise against it. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about their reaction to it. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing how the Brisbane G20 is shaping up to be a geopolitical battleground. And before the break, we were talking about how the BRICS economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, led by China and India, their commitment to economic development is starting to set the agenda for the G20 in a way that the Americans and Brits do not like, and they're reacting to it. So,
well, I think one of the, just to jump in there, Robbie, the fact that Kerry, Senator Kerry, came down or basically talked to Abbott and said, "Don't join the Australia Infrastructure Investment Bank," is typical of the freak out, right? The fact that you have one sovereign government telling another sovereign government, our government, you can't do this. You say, well, why do these guys get off?
Well, and Craig, that was such a transparent action. Like when that power exists, and always has, but the smarter powers who do that kind of thing pressure other governments, try and do it subtly. This was so transparent, and Abbott's reaction was so pathetic, where he just buckled to that and bowed the knee, right? Which shows that in practice Australia doesn't have independence, and this is, remember, the whole basis of, say, Malcolm Fraser's book, right? Dangerous Allies, that we've become so dependent on this collapsing power that we don't have independence. That has got a lot of people's attention, and it's interesting the kind of Australian figures in the last week who've come out attacking that decision that we in the CEC, we don't have that much respect for. People like Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Bob Carr, and a lot of business people, etc. But sometimes a country like America can go too far, and it's done that this time, right? And that will undermine its standing in Australia, and we'll just have to see what comes out of that.
Just an extension of the reflection of Obama's policies anyway, Robbie.
Yes,
British
as someone just mentioned to us, everything Obama touches turns to something not nice. Anyway, so here's what America's specifically doing, because they're freaked out at the way the G20 is shaping up. George W. Bush's National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, is in Australia. Now, I feel sorry for Stephen Hadley because, I mean, that must qualify as the single most embarrassing CV entry in the world. George W. Bush's National Security Advisor, right? So anyway, you've got to give him credit for being prepared to show his face in public, I suppose. He's in Australia counter-organising against the strategic relationship between Russia and China that is actually giving strength to their commitment to economic development. I want to read a quote that he told the Sydney Morning Herald, because he's trying to summarise what Russian propaganda is about what America's plans are, but in doing so, he came up with a pretty accurate summary of what America's agenda is. So this is what he said, quote, "I worry that President Putin, in his private conversations with President Xi Jinping, is making something like the following argument, that the West does not accept the legitimacy of either the Russian or the Chinese regimes." Well, Stephen, that's true. It doesn't. You know, when John McCain keeps tweeting, you know, the Arab Spring coming to Moscow, and Michael Danby here wants the colour revolutions in China, topple those governments. Well, that's what that means, right? Continuing with Hadley, that the West, led by the United States, is seeking to destabilise and change both governments. Again, true, absolutely documented, and Ukraine is the latest example of that in terms of Russia. That it is this effort that is responsible for the instability and demonstrations in both Ukraine and Hong Kong, which it is. And for that, if we haven't mentioned on this show before, for example, the leader of the student protests in Hong Kong is a businessman whose business partner is Paul Wolfowitz, the leading US neoconservative who gave the world the lies of weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War. That the agents of this Western effort are civil society groups, NGOs, free media, and dissidents, which is what they are. Those are agents, unfortunately. They get funded by Project Democracy to do this kind of toppling of government. And he concluded the quote, and that these agents of foreign influence must be stamped out in both Russia and China, end quote. So that's a pretty accurate summary of exactly what the agenda that the Anglo-Americans are pursuing, and which we've been documenting through our literature for 3 years now, right? Yep. So anyway, they're fully aware of that, not only what they're doing, but that Russia knows what they're doing. Now, consequently, Craig, what you said earlier, that Obama has not been invited to address the Parliament, but the President of China and the President of India, Prime Minister of India are. So for some reason, probably because of that, Obama has just announced that he's going to make an unscheduled speech on the sidelines of the G20, and this really is out of panic, right? Because they're seeing a country like Australia, you know, we do have a strategic dependence on the United States, but we get nothing out of them economically, and you know, at the end of the day, the functioning of your economy really is the most important thing. 45% of the people who voted against Obama in the US, and he got slaughtered in this election, their reason for voting was the economy, right? And Australia has to decide, and this is a question I wanted to put to you, we have to now weigh up our strategic dependence on the Anglo-Americans versus our economic future with Asia. And the saga of the AIIB shows America wants us to sacrifice their economic future so we can support their strategic position. So what, if Australia was truly thinking independently, what would we choose?
You have to go back to what, you know, Whitlam just recently, there's a memorial service, a very large one here in Australia for this very great Prime Minister. I mean, he was, in terms of the way he was looking at the idea of sovereignty within Australia.
His vision was great.
His vision was
not
great,
everything he did was perfect.
That is true.
But his vision was great.
But the point I was going to make, Robbie, is that that's the sort of ideas that we actually have to have down here. Look, there's a lot of slanders deliberately propagated by the West, like, you know, China is buying up everything in Australia. That's not true. The largest single foreign investment block is the USA, followed by the UK.
By far,
by miles.
10 times more than China.
And the point is that strategically, it's a one-way street, right?
Yep.
Because the issue of sovereignty for us isn't on the table. We can't say it. Well, the current political leadership can't say to America, "Get lost. We want to develop our own resources," or to the UK, as Whitlam tried to do, right? But that's exactly what we have to do. We have to move along the lines of what Egypt's doing and saying, okay, well, we're not going to tolerate an infringement of our sovereignty as we try and build the much-needed second Suez Canal. We're going to fund it internally. We're going to provide for local companies internally. We're not going to, do what we do in Australia and outsource everything to foreign companies because it's cheaper. No, we are going to provide that the ability for local companies to tender for this first. Yep. We're going to provide jobs for our young people. We're going to fund it internally, as I said before, by issuing debt bonds that only the people of Egypt can buy. Now, this is the sort of directionality that the BRICS countries are looking at. Going outside of the Anglo-American financial system, the collapsing transatlantic system, and going with new modes of credit formation, new banks like the AIIB, for large-scale infrastructure development projects for the benefit of their own populations in a sovereign way.
Yep.
And this is freaking the hell out of the G20, which represents this collapsing transatlantic faction.
And if we did that, took that approach here, imagine the potential benefits we get.
We'll most probably talk about that in the next segment, but the point is that we are a barren country, actually, by comparison of what could be done. We have next to no infrastructure. We aren't making the best or even touching the size of our scientific capacity or our medical capacity in this country. So if we were to take the Egyptian road instead of the road down the centre of London, we would have a completely transformed country overnight. But unfortunately, the tram conductor, Tony Abbott, is still stuck in London.
That's true, very much. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about that a bit more. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, unemployment is a crisis. We need economic development. And Craig, we were alluding to this before the break, but one imperative, one fact about Australia now makes it absolutely imperative, and this might shock people. The Department of Employment has produced statistics that break Australia up into these groups, these areas, small area labour markets they're called, right? And so they're discrete regions where they can provide unemployment statistics by those regions. And statistically they're called Statistical Areas Level 2, which are communities that interact together socially and economically. And what their latest report for the June quarter 2014 shows is that in those pockets, unemployment is already approaching the levels of the worst hit Eurozone countries. And this is quite shocking. So with over 200 of these discrete areas in Australia have jobless numbers that are over 10%, and often a lot more than that. A lot of them are rural communities, which is not a surprise, right? It's lots of pockets of unemployment well above 10%, but you've got pockets of the cities that are just as bad. Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart and Adelaide all have areas that predictably are the industrial areas, right, where unemployment is sky high. So for example, here in Melbourne, Broadmeadows has unemployment of 26.4%. Actual unemployment. That's the highest in this state. And of course, what's at the heart of Broadmeadows? The Ford factory.
And the surrounding machine tool complex that supplies it.
To supply it. And that's and the Ford factory is still going right now.
Yeah.
It's not shut yet. So unemployment's already at 26.4%. And the worst place in Australia is Elizabeth in South Australia, another car town, 32.4%. And that's Holden is slated to shut its doors there as well. And those figures, they're based on the standard fraudulent way that they compile their statistics anyway. So if you work an hour a week, you're not included in those statistics, and they're still that sky high. So what do? Well, we put out a press release this week where, based on a green paper issued by Barnaby Joyce a few weeks ago, and it's called Australia's Agricultural Competitiveness. And Barnaby in this paper listed 27 water projects, Craig, that could be built in Australia And when he announced it, he took some really funny swipes at the kind of green insanity that usually stops these projects, like the spotted tree frog and whatever, those types of things. And the release actually got some excitement going. People got excited, oh, finally, is something going to happen? Well, it turns out, when you read the paper, it was obvious straight away who its author was. None other than Sir Humphrey Appleby of Yes Minister. We'll just read some excerpts and you'll see what I mean. Urana Dam is one of the 17 projects in this Green Paper's category of, wait for it, quote, likely to be suitable for further consideration for possible assistance to accelerate feasibility studies, cost-benefit analysis or design, end quote.
Fluff for short.
Yes. A proposed Nathan Dam on the Dawson River in Queensland is one of 4 projects in the Green Paper's category of, quote, could warrant future consideration of possible capital investment, but less advanced in stage of development. And the Green Paper lists 6 projects in the most advanced stage of planning, quote, to allow consideration of possible capital investment within the next 12 months, end quote. So that tells you a lot right there. And then on top of that, all the particular projects they're talking about, these dams, they're all tiny little things.
They're all premised, Robbie,
puddles.
on the idea that water trading is paramount, that you have to make profit from trading water.
Yep.
Therefore, when you look at these projects from that point of view, you say, well, the feasibility of possibly getting money for these things is based upon the potentiality of private sector maybe wanting to have a gamble on the future value of whatever water is.
Yeah.
Now, that's insanity.
Yep.
We should never have had the Howard government's initiative to try and have water trading in this country. It is criminal. Yep. Water is a basic economic infrastructure requirement, and therefore, with that in mind, a government should be saying we need, particularly in a dry country like Australia, we need copious amounts of water. Now, we've done the work on this. We put together 18 very large, water projects, which are, on the scale of the Ord River Dam up in the northwest of this country.
And that's from our 2002 New Citizen called Australia's Blueprint for Economic Development.
Yeah, and the point is that you need a large-scale water projects. Small-scale stuff is only good for regional areas. You need small-scale dams, that's fine. But in terms of harvesting the sort of water in the north of this country that we have just running out into the oceans, you could build the Reed scheme, the Barwick and Dam scheme that we've got up there, the Barwick and the Bradfield scheme, and bring that water down the centre of the country. It require canals. Now, this was thought about 100 years ago, and when you look at what China's doing now with the new canal tunnelling techniques and so forth, this is eminently doable. But it can't be done on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis for private enterprise and private boardrooms.
That's right, because when you say cost-benefit analysis, it's a cost-benefit analysis that assumes, though, the necessity for private profit, and real cost-benefit analysis for nation building can't be based on that. That's what Barnaby's doing. He's trying to square the circle, you might say, by saying, well, we need to have dams and water projects. Yeah, tick for that. That's correct. But you can't do it by saying you've got to do it subject to the whims and the prejudices and the profit margins of private boards. And Craig, I was just in Europe and I got to see the canals of France, etc. And they were built, a lot of them were built by Charlemagne, 1,200 years ago. And there was no cost-benefit analysis done then, but Europe benefits immensely from them as a result. Anyway, we've run out of time. So that's it for this week's CEC report. I just wanted to mention again, as usual, if you want elaboration on what we talk about, it's in the Australian Alert Service. Call 1-800-636-432 to get a copy. But thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more of this program.